Did anything happen between us last night? The question sat in the living room like an object, small, flat, impossible to ignore. It was written in Kara's careful hand on the back of a receipt I'd shoved under the mug I'd used to make tea. 2 chipped mugs on the coffee table, an upturned scarf on the arm of the sofa, a sweater with a perfume stain folded on the chair. Every ordinary thing in my apartment had become evidence, or possible evidence, of something that might be read the wrong way. Outside, the city moved on. The elevator's faint groan through the wall, a delivery truck rattling by, the wind off the lake hitting the windows like a reminder that the world had no reason to stop for our small, terrible moment. I could have answered the question with a lie that would have been easy to live with. No, I could have said, and let whatever ambiguity there was stay ambiguous. I could have gone back to sleep on the air mattress, made coffee, and kept my mouth shut. But the question wasn't just about what happened. It was an accusation in waiting, a small detonator that could blow reputation and careers apart in a corridor of whispers. It was every friend of mine who'd warned me about office rumors, every caution my father had leveled at me when I took my first job in the city. It was for both our sakes, for hers, for mine. I closed my eyes and remembered my father's voice, soft, not angry but serious, saying once when I was 18 and about to sign my first lease, when someone's dignity is on the line, don't let convenience be the reason you look away. It was the sort of thing that lodged behind the ribs. It was also why, at 35, no 28, whatever, I'd stayed sober enough to know what I was doing the night Kara stumbled in from the gala, why I'd closed the door, why I'd set a blanket across her knees even though my hands trembled trying to be steady. She'd never asked me to stay. Not that night, not then. My apartment smelled like boiled tea and the faint chemical sweetness of her perfume. The note had been my attempt at a bridge. Practical, banal, protective. I wrote that I'd made sure she got home safely, that her keys were on the counter, that I would be available if she needed anything. I wrote that I was leaving to let her rest. I left it folded so she could find it without feeling the intrusion of a speech, a justification, or a confession. It was meant to protect both of us by naming what had happened without allowing gossip to write the rest. She read the note and, a minute later, asked that question. Her handwriting could be clinical and precise, and in the folded receipt the letters were slightly jagged, like she'd been holding the paper with a hand that didn't trust itself. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a loaded question. It's not empty so much as dense. It holds the weight of what might be admitted and the threat of what might be invented. I could feel every small noise in the room, my breath, the heater clinking, the distant hum of traffic. I answered honestly. I told her the truth in the way the truth needed telling, plain, careful, and without color. Nothing happened beyond what happened. No kiss, no crossing of lines in the that matter. I'd helped her home because she couldn't safely find her way alone. I had left when she was sleeping, because it felt wrong to stay without being asked. She didn't ask me to stay, so I left. It was a simple, clean motion on paper, but in life clean motions always splinter into shards. I put on my coat, put my shoes by the door, and walked out into the morning that smelled faintly of winter and coffee. I left my keys beside a bowl, along with a folded thank you and an explanation that would not require a conversation at the moment. Outside, the city had already taken whatever little drama might have unfolded, and folded it into its own narrative. Pedestrians hurried past the lobby. A bicyclist clipped the curb. I slid into the elevator and focused on the numbers lighting up on the panel to steady myself. I think of that morning often. I replay the way my hands felt when I left, how my chest seemed both lighter and heavier at once. There was relief. Relief that I had not done anything that could be misread. But there was also a palpable hollowness, like a house suddenly empty after you've been the one to leave. It was an absence that would follow me into work, into the fluorescent-lit conference rooms, into the small talk in the break room. It was an absence that changed the geometry of my life. Before all that, though, I should go back to the gala and lay the evening out flat, the way you lay out a map to find where you lost your footing. We were there for a client, a fundraiser with bar carts spaced like islands, low jazz playing by a trio whose bassist wore a solemn face. Kara had asked me to attend to take notes and keep an eye on the numbers. She wore a dress that made her look far less like the managing director who could cut the budget with a glance, and more like someone trying on a different, softer version of herself. She was crooked laughter and a looseness I'd never seen in her office. I remember the way she set down her clutch and let her shoulders unroll for a second. I remember thinking, in that casual way of someone who knows the contours of a person at work, that the loosening might be temporary. Later, she was alone by the punch bowl. Someone bumped into her. A tray tipped, a spill of red-crossed satin. I saw the way she steadied herself against the table and the way the light in her eyes had gone slightly unfocused. I saw her laugh too loudly at a joke a colleague told, and I saw the unfamiliar softness that came when a normally taut face slackened. I remembered my father's cautiousness and the practical part of me that scans exits and tries to prevent catastrophes. Helping her was not a romantic calculus, it was a moral one. In my internal ledger, I had one entry. She was vulnerable and alone. I could leave her to the crowd and hope someone else noticed, or I could make the decision to be the one to notice. Those were the only two options, and the choice felt both obvious and fraught. There was power on her side, power that made me careful, because she was the sort of boss whose favor could tilt a project or whose glance could alter a meeting's tone. I thought of that and still chose to act. I wrapped my scarf around her shoulders as she swayed, murmured something about getting her to a cab, and half-guided her to the curb. The wind had another bite that night, and the taxi's headlights looked too brave against the wet pavement. Her perfume smelled like lilies, and a faint sweetness that clung to the air. When she slumped into the back seat, hands trembling, I told the driver clearly where to go and offered my card in case he needed contact details. I rode for a few blocks in the passenger seat, quiet, listening to her breathe and trying to make myself useful. At my building, I carried her up the steps. Apartment keys, a soft blanket, a glass of water. These are the small acts that amount to hospitality, not heroism. I put an extra pillow behind her, made sure the heater was on, and kept a light on in the hallway so she wouldn't walk into a dark room when she woke. I remember folding my father's overcoat over my arm, as if it could temper the night's sharp edges. I left her with a glass of water, her phone charged and my own clothes folded in a chair. I left a note on my kitchen counter so she would find it without having to ask. I told myself that leaving when she slept would be the responsible move. If she woke and needed anything, she had my number. If she didn't, then I hadn't exploited her trust or her vulnerability. That night, I slept on a commercially unremarkable air mattress beside a bookshelf full of jazz records, the city's neon leaking across the blinds. I listened to her breath through the wall and to the small noises that sound like proof you're still human. I didn't sleep well. I imagined the landscape of rumor and how quickly it could flatten someone. I imagined a version where someone else saw us too close together, where a passing comment at a copy machine became a narrative that had nothing to do with the truth. I thought of my colleagues, of Tom's angular brow and tendency toward the convenient assumption. I thought of family dinners where my father reminded me that sometimes the right action is quiet and unwanted. I also thought of Kara, how her authority seemed to be stitched from 100 small compromises someone else never noticed. Her vulnerability that night had been not a misdemeanor, but an anomaly. Raw, honest, and unguarded. How do you respond to someone whose composure has slipped? Do you take advantage of the gap? Do you step back and let it reknit? Neither answer felt adequate on its own. I tried to navigate between the two, helpful without patronizing, protective without infantilizing. I promised myself, quietly, that I would not be the kind of person who allowed explanation to slouch into insinuation. Morning arrived like a thin apology. She called at first light, voice tight, composed more by panic than caffeine. She told me she'd found my note and was sitting with it at the kitchen table, the sunlight a pale wash through the blinds. She said she wasn't sure what to think. She dialed her friend, Rachel, who came over with a bag of aspirin and a face that mixed worry with practical concern. Kara asked Rachel to sit with her and make sure she was okay. Then she called me back, quieter, and asked the central question in a way that made me feel as if she were measuring the space between truth and rumor with her hands. Did anything happen between us last night? There were other choices I could have made in that moment, choices that might have both preserved a soft connection and hardened boundaries in my favor. I could have waited. I could have let her speak more until she finally, consciously asked me to stay. I could have assumed that, given the sort of woman she was, she might never ask aloud. But the heart of it was not what someone else might or should do. It was the respect due to her agency, to the very idea that consent is not transactional but explicit. She didn't ask me to stay, so I left. When I speak that sentence now, I often have to explain what it meant. Leaving felt like making a promise to myself not to let convenience or misinterpretation do the moral work for me. It was not a retreat out of fear that she might return the feeling. It was not a moral failing to avoid potential pain. It was a way to preserve her dignity in the face of her vulnerability. If she wanted me to stay as more than a neighbor, I wanted that to be her choice, free of blurred judgment. If she did not, I did not want to be the footnote in some rumor. The decision was about boundaries, clear, deliberate, and, I hoped, honorable. When I left, I walked down the hallway with a jacket over my arm and a watchful eye on the way the morning light hit the tiles. I felt like someone who had closed a door behind himself in order not to be used by circumstance. In the space that followed, the office grew smaller in some ways and harsher in others. People are funny in how they refold into trajectories. Some things are noticed because they are different, and our brains like to explain difference with stories. By the time I stepped into the elevator at 8:30, I felt as if I was carrying not just my satchel, but the possibility of a rumor. At work the change was not immediate, but it was there in shuttered glances and in how the coffee machine conversation stuttered. Tom Keller, who has a habit of speaking in observations that double as suggestions, didn't bring it up directly. He never did. He prefers the indirect path, the raised eyebrow in a meeting, an offhand remark about company culture that is sharp enough to cut if left unattended. I watched the room measure me when Kara walked in with a face deliberately scrubbed of the night's looseness. She was all business. Her emails were efficient. Her lingering looks were compressed into a professional rhythm that gave nothing away. Rumor, as it tends to, is patient and inventive. People fill gaps with plausible stories because silence is uncomfortable. A hallway whisper became a speculative series of observations passed along with the salt of gossip and the hunger for narrative. For a while I felt like an island everyone assumed the tide might reach. Some colleagues avoided me, others were kinder, as if being kind could fix an imbalance of power. My friends called. Rachel texted an olive branch of cautious concern, and my father's voice returned in memory. "You did what you could to protect her," he said once, when I was trying to explain the nuance to him. "Now protect yourself." The way Kara handled the aftermath told me more about her than anything else. She had always controlled appearances, decisions that reeked of precision, but she surprised me by being the first to insist on transparency. A week after the gala, she requested a meeting with HR. I wasn't there when it happened. She told me after, in a voice that sounded like someone who'd been relieved by a difficult but necessary action. She had chosen, without my prompting, to lay the facts out in a small administration office, name the incident, and ask for reassignment. She wanted to remove the power imbalance from our potential future interactions. She wanted, in short, to clear a path that would allow any later intimacy to be genuinely equal. Her choice made sense. It was hard and brave. It was also the kind of step that reconfigures trust slowly, like sand shifted at the base of a building until the structure rests on steadier ground. I respected her for it, and I was aware all at once of how fragile that respect was in the environment where our reputations mattered. People often frame such moments as either the end of something or the beginning, an either-or, but life is weirder. It's both. The reassignment gave us a buffer. It was not the solution. It was a tool. It allowed us to meet not as subordinate and boss, but as two people who had taken deliberate steps to safeguard one another from potential misunderstanding. We had to relearn each other from that place, step by careful step. The first time we met after the reassignment, it felt like fumbling with a script neither of us had been given. We sat in a coffee shop with mismatched chairs, both of us choosing our words like we were calibrating a new instrument. She looked different in a way that wasn't just about the dress or the office. The looseness that had frightened me now looked like a human person who had been through something and was still piecing the edges together. We talked about small things at first. Reports, travel times, a book she had recommended months ago. We avoided the gala. We intentionally, beautifully, made ourselves small together. There is an awkwardness in all reparation that is both tender and embarrassing. You are both acknowledging the fragility and inviting it back into the room. At times we stumbled, small misreadings, quiet retractions. At others we moved forward with a gentleness that felt like repairing a membrane. Careful, patient, not assuming it would be back to what it once was in a day. Slow affection grew in the seams made safe by our decisions. We ate dinners that were unremarkable, and therefore delicious. Roasted carrots, avocado toast, a soup with not enough salt that we laughed at. We went on walks where she would point out odd things she noticed. An old brick building whose cornices looked like teeth. A stray cat that seemed to have a permanent scowl. Those ordinary things were our way back to each other, a ladder built of mundane steps. There were nights with quiet conversations about family, her mother's garden, my father's stubborn thriftiness, and nights when we simply sat in silence, letting the city's hum shape our presence. At no point did anything happen without explicit mutual consent. When the first kiss arrived, months after the gala, on a night when the air smelled like late summer and we had both agreed to meet after work, it was the kind of slow, deliberate thing that felt right precisely because it had been chosen. There is a tenderness in consent that the world often neglects. It is not merely permission, but a promise that both parties have cleared the space for the other. We discussed the small logistics, too. We talked about how our work would continue to be separate. We talked about expectations. We were not romantic fools or reckless rebels. We were two adults who had learned the value of being explicit and careful. The town's rumor mill had not entirely stopped, of course. People love arcs, fall, redemption, explanation. But we found an odd kind of armor in transparency. When Kara initiated the meeting with HR and asked for reassignment, she had effectively moved the conversation from whisper to record. When people tried to reconstruct the night, the record pushed back. It did not eliminate speculation, but it diminished the space rumor needs to grow. We were not saved by bureaucracy. We were helped by honesty implemented as action. There were costs. The reassignment meant Kara no longer sat in the same set of meetings I did. She no longer had direct oversight of the projects where I made my name. That had career consequences, small and large, and we both had to weigh them. She lost a bit of formal power. I lost a path to a certain promotion trajectory. We traded a ladder for a safer footing. It was a bargain we both accepted. Time has a strangling way of softening edges if you let it. Over months, the awkwardness in the office faded into a new normal because we let it. We made a habit of being clear in small things. Texts that asked about plans, a scheduling calendar that had our meetings marked as personal time if needed, mutual respect in public settings where power dynamics could be noticed. We honored each other's capacity to say no. Our slow tenderness turned into something steadier. Small weekend getaways became a ritual. Cabin in the woods where there was no cell signal and only the sound of leaves. A rented room by a lake that smelled of pine and the faint hint of fish. These trips were tiny rooms where we could practice being ourselves without the office breathing down our necks. I watched her sleep on more than one morning, the way the light fell across her pillow, the pattern of her hair. I listened to stories she'd never tell the company Christmas party, about a childhood spent picking berries in a garden, about a brother who used to fix radios. She listened to the way I talked about my father, to the stories about thrift store finds and the old jazz club where I'd once spent a long night, because I couldn't sleep. When we finally acknowledged to one another that there was something we wanted to explore together, it was careful and mutual. We set boundaries. No working nights together, no private messages that could be misread by others, full disclosure to HR about how we planned to proceed. We wanted to be sure that whatever lived between us had its own life, not the distorted one gossip wanted to replay. Our transparency didn't make us immune to opinion, but it made us honest to ourselves and others. This is the baseline we insisted on. One winter evening, a year and some months after the gala, we were standing in my kitchen with 2 mugs and the radio low in the background. Snow had started falling softly outside, the kind that makes the city quiet, buffers it like a well-placed hand. Kara laughed at something I said, a short, delighted sound, and for a second she looked like someone who had arrived at a place she'd once feared. I asked her, more as a habit than with any intention, if she remembered that morning with the note. She nodded, wiping her hands on a dish towel. "You left," she said, more observation than accusation. "I did," I replied. "You didn't ask me to stay." She looked at me then, with an honesty that had become one of her most lovely traits. "It was the right thing," she said. "It was the only way I could be sure anything that followed was mine." Her eyes were steady. It made me notice how I felt when people took care of me when I wasn't at my best. It made me want to do the work to learn how to ask for help when I needed it. She took a breath. And to be clear, when I wanted more. We had both worked to get to the point where those words could be said without the weight of shame or fear. Our tenderness had been earned. That was the rarest, most valuable part of it. A few weeks after that kitchen conversation, on a lake I'd only seen in autumn when the trees were already bare, I asked her very simply to marry me. I had spent days thinking about ways to stage it, some elaborate plan that would make it cinematic and safe to remember. In the end, I chose simplicity. The lake was quiet, the light low, and her hand in mine felt like the most natural thing in the world. I said nothing dramatic. I couldn't have delivered it if I tried. But I took her hand gently and said, "Will you marry me?" The words were an echo of months. The proposal was not about writing a night or compelling forgiveness. It was about recognizing that we had built a relationship out of 1,000 small intentional choices. She said yes with a laugh and then a long breath, like someone exhaling after a long swim. We both cried a little. Neither of us made the moment about what we had avoided. It was about what we had become. 2 adults who had chosen to rebuild from honesty and courage. Later, sitting in the cabin, I thought about how the night of the gala could have been the end of anything. Instead, it became the first test of how we would act toward one another in an imperfect world. If there's a moral to the story, it is not tidy. Actions framed by a respect for agency can be hard, lonely, and sometimes costly. They can also be the start of something durable. My leaving that morning could be read as an avoidance. It could be read as a retreat. To me, it was a deliberate choice to shield dignity and to force clarity. Had I stayed without being asked, we might have been trapped by the story other people would tell. By leaving, I gave us both the space to choose honestly later. Years later, people still ask about that morning in small, curious ways. "How did you know?" friends will say, or, "Was it complicated?" The answer always is that it was both. Life is messy. People in positions of authority are people first. Vulnerability is not an invitation, it is a responsibility to respond to with care. I'm not an exception. I don't have some special moral stockpile. I'm simply a man who was taught that dignity is worth protecting even when it costs you short-term comfort. My father would have been brief about it. You act right not because it's easy, but because it's right. I think now, he would have liked Kara. He would have admired how she handled the aftermath, the way she chose to be transparent and to own her part of the story. He would have nodded at the way I chose to step back when the line between helpfulness and presumption was blurred. People sometimes ask if anything salacious happened that night. The answer is no. That's not the point. The point is the way we chose to act in the face of ambiguity and the boundary between power and care. She didn't ask me to stay, and in that refusal, or perhaps in that failure to ask because she was not in a state to, I made a decision that reshaped our lives. My leaving was not an end. It was a beginning, one that required patience, honesty, and the slow rebuilding of trust. In the end, the proposal reframed everything. When she slipped the ring on my finger, an impossibly small, quiet thing unlike the loud displays you see in movies. It felt like an answer to the question she had posed with trembling handwriting on a receipt. The question had been heavy, a possible destroyer of careers and reputations. The answer arrived years later in a snow-soft kitchen, and in the word yes. It was not a reversal of the morning, but a reminder that agency matters, that consent and clarity are the bedrock of anything that can stay. If anything of this sticks with you, it's this. Doing the right thing might feel like losing in the short term. It might mean walking away from a convenient closeness to preserve someone's right to choose. It might mean accepting isolation for a while as rumor circles and settles. But if the other person is willing to meet you later in the light, with transparency and with deliberate consent, the path forward is less shaky. Have you ever had to risk being misunderstood to protect someone else's dignity? If this story resonates, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. I don't tell this to impress anyone, nor to make moral mountains of what are, in the end, daily human choices. I tell it because the sharpest tests of character aren't always in the big uprisings of life. They're in the small acts. Whether you tuck a blanket around a stranger at the bus stop, whether you sign the paperwork that makes a situation safe, whether you step out of a room so another person can decide who they are. We learned, together and alone, that transparency and intentionality can create a healthier kind of intimacy. We learned that power requires humility, and that vulnerability deserves clear, loving response. We learned that a note left on a counter, practical, honest, unsentimental, can be the first step towards something real. Some nights I still think about the mugs on my coffee table and the folded receipt lying between them. It's a small relic of the moment that started everything. The question on that paper could have ended careers, turned colleagues into judges, left both of us shamed by rumor. Instead, we used the embarrassment and the fear to force ourselves into a conversation about what we wanted and how to get there, without hurting each other. She didn't ask me to stay, so I left. That choice was the beginning of a long, slow proof that love, when built on candor and respect, looks less like a lightning strike and more like a steady, carefully tended flame. If you're listening to this and wondering whether to stay or go in your own life, remember, leaving can be an act of protection. It can be the thing that opens the door to what comes next, if what comes next is chosen freely by both of you. If you liked this story, or found something in it that matters, consider subscribing to hear more like it and share it with someone who might appreciate a careful kind of hope.